She never dreamed of castles or gowns. Her dreams were simple: a home filled with peace, a kitchen with warm food, a voice she could trust, someone who would stay. Emma gave everything she had to love, not just her affection, but her time, her belief, her prayers. She believed in him, not just in his ambition, but in the softness she saw behind his driven eyes. His name was Jonathan, a man with a future as wide as the horizon. People called him brilliant. He was rising fast, chasing success like it was the only thing that mattered. But with Emma, he slowed down, at least for a while. He held her hand like it was a promise. He spoke of someday like it was already here. And so, she gave him her trust. She followed him through small apartments, tight budgets, and long nights, always believing in them, in their future, in the love she thought they were building, until the day that love vanished, like it had never been real. He didn't leave with a fight. He didn't shout or cry or beg her to understand. He just left. A few words about needing more, about chasing dreams, about how she wouldn't understand. Then the door closed, and silence filled the space where his promises used to live. Emma stood at the doorway, breath caught in her throat. The air felt too heavy, like even it had decided to leave. But Jonathan never turned around. He didn't look back. He didn't see the woman standing there, already carrying his child. She didn't tell anyone right away, not her parents, not her friends. She wrapped her arms around her belly, still small, and whispered prayers in the dark. She wasn't sure what she was praying for. Courage, maybe, or clarity, or just to feel less alone. She stopped hoping he'd come back, but she did hope God was still listening, and somehow, she felt he was. So she kept going. The weeks turned into months. Her body changed. Her world shrunk. She found work cleaning offices at night and waitressing during the day. She memorized every discount at the market, every free clinic downtown. And still, she never stopped talking to the life inside her. "Your daddy's gone," she would whisper. "But I'm here. I'll always be here." She spoke faith over that baby like it was armor, like it was enough. The day her son was born, the world slowed down. His name was Daniel. He came into the world quietly, not with a scream, but with wide eyes and a calmness that made the nurses pause. Emma looked into his face and saw her purpose. This child wasn't a reminder of abandonment. He was proof that life could still rise from what was broken. She kissed his forehead and promised him, "I will never make you feel unwanted." The years ahead were not kind. There were nights Emma didn't eat so he could. Mornings she worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. But Daniel never lacked love. He never once saw her break, and not completely. She taught him to pray before school, to say thank you even when it hurt, to believe that kindness was strength. And when he asked about his father, she didn't lie. She told him. He left. But God didn't. Daniel nodded. Just once. And that was enough. By the time Daniel turned 10, he had the soul of someone much older. Neighbors would say, "There's something special about that boy." He opened doors without being asked, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, sat with classmates who had no friends. Emma watched him grow with awe, and every night, as she folded his laundry or packed his lunch, she whispered, "Thank you, God. You knew I couldn't do this alone." And then, it happened. A Saturday morning, ordinary in every way. The sun was soft, the breeze warm. Emma and Daniel walked into the local market, laughing about a recipe they wanted to try. She reached for apples. He handed her a basket. It was peaceful, until she heard a voice, deep, familiar, almost forgotten. "Emma?" Her body froze. She turned, slowly, and there he was, Jonathan, 10 years older, a little worn, still sharply dressed, but quieter, almost searching. Her heart raced, not with hope, not with longing, but with memory. She stood taller, looked him in the eye. He gave a faint smile. Then his eyes drifted to the boy beside her, and something in him changed. He didn't speak. He just stared. Daniel tilted his head, then smiled politely. Jonathan's lips parted, like he wanted to ask something but couldn't find the words. And for a moment, no one moved. The air shifted. The past and the present collided, and the silence said more than words ever could. Emma finally broke the moment. "This is Daniel," she said softly. Jonathan blinked. "How old is he?" 10, she replied. Her voice was calm, steady. He did the math. His eyes widened, just slightly. Daniel, sensing something, offered his hand. Nice to meet you, sir. Jonathan hesitated, then took it. His hand shook, because in that moment, he felt something familiar. The way the boy stood, the look in his eyes, the calm strength in his handshake. It was like shaking hands with a version of himself he didn't know existed. They spoke only for a few minutes. Polite words, surface-level conversation. But when Jonathan walked away, he wasn't the same. He looked back one more time, and for the first time in years, his eyes held something real, regret. That night, Emma sat on the couch, staring at the empty teacup in her hand. Daniel was already asleep. She whispered to the silence, God, what now? She didn't know what was coming. She only knew this. That boy sleeping in the other room was her purpose. That man from her past was not her anchor anymore. But somehow, she felt the ground beneath her shift, like something long buried was beginning to surface. And God, in his quiet, mysterious way, was not done writing the story. It happened so quietly. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no warnings. One morning, Emma woke up to a man who had already made up his mind. He didn't say it with cruelty, but there was no tenderness either. His suitcase stood by the door, packed with precision, cold in its finality. I need more, he said, eyes not meeting hers. This life, it's not enough for me. Emma didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because something inside her knew he was already gone. Even before he finished his sentence, his heart had left the room. The air shifted, not with rage, but with loss. She stood still as he walked past her, not a brush of the shoulder, not a backward glance. He paused for a second by the door, maybe to say something else, maybe to remember her face, but he didn't. He walked out, and Emma stood there, in her thin robe, barefoot on the cold tile, watching the silence expand. A single tear traced her cheek, not from weakness but from release, because something sacred had been severed, and nothing would ever be the same again. She didn't chase him. She didn't beg. She closed the door gently, then walked to the window. The sky was still. The world outside didn't know what she'd just lost, and that somehow made it harder. She placed a hand on her belly, still flat, still silent. He didn't know. She hadn't told him. She was pregnant. It wasn't planned. It wasn't expected, and now, it felt like a secret too heavy to carry alone. But Emma didn't fall apart. She let herself sit on the couch, legs tucked under her, and cried without sound. Her tears weren't for the man who left. They were for the woman who stayed, the one who now had to become someone else. She remembered the first time she met Jonathan. He had that spark, that irresistible mix of charm and certainty. People listened when he spoke. Women noticed when he entered a room. But Emma, she saw something deeper. She saw the weight he carried behind the ambition. She saw the way he touched his father's old watch, as if still seeking approval. She believed her love could be his peace. But peace was never what he wanted. He wanted more. More money, more recognition, more success. And she, in her quiet, loyal way, became too still for him. Now, alone in that quiet apartment, she faced the new truth. He was gone, and she was expecting a baby, a heartbeat, a future, growing inside her without permission, without plan, but not without purpose. Emma wasn't weak. She had grown up watching her mother endure far worse. A marriage held together by obligation and Sunday smiles. A father who provided but never truly stayed. Emma had sworn she'd build something different. And now, it was just her, and the child who didn't ask to be born into heartbreak. She got up the next morning as if nothing had changed, because the world didn't stop for grief. She pulled her hair back, put on her uniform, packed a sandwich for her break, and went to work. At night, she walked slowly through the aisles of the dollar store, counting each item, doing the math twice. Diapers, vitamins, a secondhand baby book. She tucked it all under her coat when it started to rain. No umbrella, just her and the weight of beginning again. Some nights she'd lay in bed with her hands on her stomach and whisper stories to the baby. She told him about the stars, about how people look up at them for hope, for direction, and how she believed, maybe, just maybe, God had placed one inside her, a small light, growing slowly, but surely, even when everything else had gone dark. She worked, she prayed, she moved through the days like a quiet storm, steady, silent, strong. People began to notice, not her pain, but her presence, the way she carried herself, the way she never complained. Emma had become invisible to the man who left, but unforgettable to the world around her. When her belly began to show, no one asked about the father. Maybe they sensed it. Maybe they respected the way she held her chin high and her voice low. She refused to speak bitterness. She refused to let her son be defined by absence. One afternoon, her old neighbor, Mrs. Howard, stopped her in the hallway. "Emma," she said softly, "you look different." Emma smiled, hand resting on her belly. "I am." The older woman nodded. "It's hard, isn't it?" Emma didn't need to ask what she meant. She simply replied, "Yes, but I'm not alone." And in that moment, Mrs. Howard's eyes welled up, because she knew. She had once stood in Emma's shoes, long ago, and she had made it. The weeks turned into trimesters. Emma learned the rhythm of solitude, but never allowed it to become loneliness. She played music while folding baby clothes from the thrift store. She wrote letters to her unborn child, letters she'd tuck in a box to give him someday. In those letters, she told him the truth, not the betrayal, not the pain, but the beauty of beginnings, of how love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's soft, hidden, carried in silence. She prepared the nursery with care, a small corner in her bedroom, sectioned off with curtains, painted clouds on the wall, a crib from a church donation, a quilt from her mother. She prayed over it every night, not asking for Jonathan to return, but asking for peace, for wisdom, for the kind of strength that doesn't need applause. Emma never saw herself as a hero, but that's what she was becoming, not because she chose it, but because she refused to give up. Even when the father of her child walked away without looking back, even when her body ached and her spirit trembled, she stood, she showed up, and slowly, the storm she feared passed. Because sometimes, the worst part isn't the leaving. It's the silence that follows, the quiet that wraps around your name like fog, the absence of closure. But Emma didn't need closure. She needed clarity, and in the stillness, she found it. Jonathan left before the storm even came. He never saw the rain, never felt the weight of the thunder. He missed the breaking and the rebuilding, and that may have been his greatest loss, because in the wreckage he abandoned, something holy was born, not just a child, but a woman transformed. A woman who discovered that being left doesn't mean being unloved. It means being redirected, refined, rewritten by grace. He never asked, not once. Not after the door closed behind him, not when the seasons changed, not when years blurred into comfort and wealth. Jonathan buried the past like a secret too inconvenient to carry. He didn't send a letter. He didn't make a call. And in the silence, something sacred was erased, at least in his mind, but not in Emma's, not in Daniel's, because the child he never knew never forgot the absence, even if he couldn't yet name it. Jonathan dove into success like it was salvation. He closed deals with precision, built empires with charm and cold efficiency. He became a man of wealth, power, influence. And yet there were nights he would lie awake in silence, staring at the ceiling, feeling something missing. He didn't know what it was. Or maybe he knew, and chose not to admit it. Because to admit it would mean facing what he left behind. Emma never tried to reach him, not out of pride, but out of protection. She had learned early. Some absences are safer left untouched. Daniel didn't need a man who chose ambition over love. He needed truth, and stability, and faith, and that she could give. So she chose not to chase. She chose to build something unshakable, not on broken promises, but on daily grace. There was a photo once, a small one of Jonathan tucked in a drawer. Emma found it while moving boxes. She held it for a moment. The jawline Daniel had, the eyes, the same tilt of the head. She stared at it in silence, then tucked it away again, not hidden out of shame, but set aside for the right time. Some truths aren't meant to be rushed. Daniel never knew what it meant to be fathered, but he knew what it meant to be seen. Emma gave him that. She saw his every joy, every struggle, every quiet question. She saw when he tried to be brave. She saw when he needed to cry but didn't know how. And so, she stood in the gap, not just as mother, but as anchor. He was 6 when he asked, for the first time, "Mom, why don't I have a dad like the other kids?" Emma's breath caught in her chest, not because she didn't expect the question, but because no mother ever feels ready to answer it. She knelt down, placed both hands on his shoulders and said, "Because sometimes people leave when they shouldn't. But God never does." Daniel looked at her, eyes wide, searching. Then he whispered, "I don't need a dad. I have you." And that night, Emma cried, not from pain, but from awe, because somehow this boy, born from silence and sorrow, had already learned to speak light. Jonathan, on the other side of the city, was busy expanding his reach. His name was in magazines, his face on event walls, his words quoted at conferences. He was applauded, admired, envied, but never deeply known. The women who shared his bed never saw his shadows. The friends who toasted his wins never asked about the years before, and Jonathan liked it that way. The past was inconvenient, until it wasn't. Sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, he'd catch a child's laugh echoing down the street and feel something stir. Or he'd see a boy with his mother in a park and pause, just for a second. But he always brushed it off. He told himself, "I made the right choice. I wasn't ready." She knew that. And in his mind, it became a story so rehearsed that even he believed it. But stories told in silence still live in the heart. And somewhere deep inside him a voice kept whispering, there was more. He ignored it, drowned it in deals, distracted it with dinners, smothered it with noise. But the soul cannot be lied to forever. Meanwhile, Daniel grew. Each year brought new questions, new dreams, new reflections in the mirror. He began to notice the absence in photos, the empty space on Father's Day. But he never grew bitter, because Emma had taught him that love was not always where it should be, but it could still be enough. She taught him to pray, not for what was missing, but for what was present. One night, as he lay in bed 9 years old, he whispered, "God, I hope my dad is okay, even if I never meet him." Emma stood in the hallway, hand over her mouth, holding back tears. That was the night she decided something. She wouldn't let this boy carry the weight of someone else's silence. She would speak truth, but never with poison. She would tell him the story one day, all of it. But first, she would give him the tools to hold it with grace. There was something about Daniel. Teachers noticed it. Strangers mentioned it. A gentleness, a strength, a presence. He didn't push his way into rooms, but people noticed when he was there. He spoke with clarity. He listened without judgment. Emma often wondered how someone so young could carry such wisdom. She knew the answer, because he had been raised not by comfort, but by conviction, not by wealth, but by purpose. Jonathan's name was never spoken in bitterness. Emma taught Daniel to honor even the people who failed, not because they deserved it, but because bitterness binds and forgiveness frees. There were nights she still prayed for Jonathan, not to return, not to make amends, but that he would find truth, that his soul, buried under layers of achievement, would one day feel again. Because she believed, even the hardest hearts can be softened, even the most lost can be found. And she knew something else, that secrets buried are never truly dead. They wait, not to haunt, but to be healed. The child he never knew had become a boy the world couldn't ignore. He didn't wear his father's absence like a wound. He wore it like a scar, healed, but remembered. He used it to build empathy, to understand those who had less, to comfort those who hurt in silence. Daniel was a mirror, and one day Emma knew that mirror would be placed in front of the man who left. And when that day came, he would see more than a boy. He would see a legacy he never claimed, a son who became a man without him, a reflection that would ask no questions, but carry all the answers. Because some things cannot be buried forever, not the past, not the truth, and not the quiet, steady love of a child who never stopped hoping, even without knowing what he hoped for. There is a kind of strength that doesn't shout. It doesn't lift weights or build empires. It doesn't wear medals or chase applause. It rises in silence. It folds laundry after midnight. It prays when no one is watching. It shows up every single day, without needing to be asked. That was Emma's strength, and it became the foundation of Daniel's world. Raising a boy without a father wasn't just hard, it was heavy. There were nights Emma would sit by the window after Daniel fell asleep, her body aching, her heart wrestling with doubts. Was she enough? Would he suffer for what he didn't have? Could she teach him to be a man, when all she knew was how to survive? But then she'd hear his breathing in the next room, soft, steady. She'd feel the warmth of his presence even in the silence. And she'd remember, she wasn't doing this alone. God had stayed. Even when Jonathan walked away, Daniel never lacked love. Emma made sure of that. She woke him with kisses on the forehead and sent him to school with prayers tucked inside his lunchbox. She worked extra hours so he could join field trips, wear clean clothes, and have cake on his birthday. She didn't have much, but she gave him everything she had, and somehow, it was more than enough. He grew in the presence of a woman who refused to give up. He watched her hold back tears at the kitchen sink. He saw her fall asleep in the living room with her shoes still on. He heard her whisper prayers when she thought he was too young to understand. And even though he didn't know what it meant yet, he felt it. Her love was a shield. Her faith was a map. Her strength, quiet as it was, shaped every part of him. One evening, when Daniel was about 8, they sat on the porch watching the rain. He leaned his head on her shoulder and said, "You're like a superhero, Mom, but the kind no one sees." Emma smiled. "Some heroes don't wear capes," she said gently. "They wear grocery store aprons." He laughed. "I like your apron better." And in that moment she knew. She wasn't raising a boy who was missing something. She was raising a boy who was gaining something rare. Perspective, depth, gratitude. There were hard days, of course. Days when the power got shut off. Days when Daniel came home from school quieter than usual. A classmate had asked about his dad again. He didn't lie. He just said, "It's just me and Mom, but we're good." And he meant it. Because Emma never taught him to pity himself. She taught him to see blessings in small places, like pancakes for dinner, or notes left in his backpack, or the way she looked at him when he played piano, eyes shining with pride. As he got older, the questions deepened, not just about his father, but about life. Why do some people leave? Why does God let things happen? Emma never pretended to have all the answers, but she always told him the truth. "Sometimes people don't know how to stay," she said. "But God never leaves, not for a second." Daniel carried those words with him like a compass. They didn't erase the ache, but they gave it purpose. He began to mirror her resilience. When Emma got sick one winter and couldn't work, Daniel found a neighbor who needed help walking dogs. He earned just enough to buy soup and tea and a small flower from the corner market. He walked into their little apartment, handed her the bag, and said, "We're okay, Mom." And in that moment, Emma felt something holy pass between them. A reversal, not of roles, but of strength. He was becoming the kind of man she had prayed for, not because of what he had, but because of who he chose to be. Emma watched him grow with reverence, not like a parent ticking milestones, but like someone witnessing grace unfold in slow motion. His voice deepened, his questions sharpened, but his heart, that stayed soft. He didn't become bitter. He didn't become cold. He became kind, and that she knew was a miracle. Every time he opened a door for a stranger, she smiled. Every time he helped a classmate, she whispered a prayer of thanks. Every time someone said, "He's so respectful, so calm, so mature," she nodded, but deep down she thought, they don't know what it cost him to become that. She never said it out loud, but sometimes late at night she wondered what Jonathan would think if he saw Daniel now. Would he recognize the boy? Would he feel pride, shame, regret? Would he see the familiar tilt of his head, the same hands, the same fire in the eyes? She didn't know, and she didn't chase the thought, because her focus was on the man Daniel was becoming, not the man who never stayed. Still, the absence had its echoes. When Father's Day came around, Daniel never complained. He made Emma breakfast instead. "Happy Everything Day," he'd say, grinning. Emma laughed, holding back tears. "You're my everything," she whispered. And it was true. She had been mother and father, comfort and discipline, foundation and wings. And Daniel, he was her reward. Not because he was perfect, but because he had chosen goodness, even when pain had given him permission to do otherwise. At school, teachers noticed something rare. Daniel had the kind of focus that didn't come from fear but from drive. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he had presence. He spoke only when he had something to say, and when he did, people listened. Emma once overheard a teacher tell another, "There's something noble in that boy, like he's carrying a story we don't know." She smiled, because he was. A story of sacrifice, of unseen love, of quiet, steady redemption. Daniel never knew the full weight of what his mother had done. Not yet. He didn't see the nights she went without dinner so he'd have seconds. He didn't know about the job offers she declined because they would take her away from him too much. He didn't realize how many times she sat in church alone in a pew, whispering prayers for his future. But one day he would. And when that day came, he would stand taller. Because behind every strong man is a woman who bent without breaking. Emma never tried to become both parents. She didn't need to. She simply became herself, fully, fiercely, faithfully, and that was more than enough. Daniel grew in the light of her example. He didn't just survive fatherlessness. He transcended it, because his identity wasn't shaped by who left. It was shaped by who stayed, by who showed up, every day, every moment, without applause, without reward, but with love, always. With love. He didn't walk into a room looking for attention. He didn't speak louder than anyone else. And yet people noticed him. Everywhere he went, Daniel left something behind, a presence, a pause, a calm. There was something in his eyes. Not intensity, not sorrow, but light. Not the blinding kind, the quiet kind. The kind that makes you stop and wonder why you feel safer when he's near. Emma noticed it first, of course, mothers always do. It started young, the way he comforted other children when they cried, the way he would pause to listen to someone who was hurting, even when he didn't understand their pain. He never judged. He never rushed. He just made space. And in a world that often doesn't, that alone made him stand out. By the time Daniel turned 13, people began saying things like, "There's something about him." Emma would nod, not out of pride, but reverence, because she knew what they were seeing. They were seeing grace in human form, and it had been forged through fire. He didn't carry his father's name. He didn't even know the full story yet. But he carried his absence like someone carries a stone in their pocket. Not to forget, but to remember what it cost to grow strong. That strength wasn't loud. It didn't intimidate. It didn't compete. It served. Daniel volunteered at the local church without being asked. He helped clean up after youth group, stack chairs, wash dishes. He offered to mow lawns for elderly neighbors. And he did it not for applause, but because something inside him whispered, "Give." Emma once found him sitting on the porch watching the sunset, eyes full of thought. "What's on your mind?" she asked. He shrugged, "Just thinking how the sun always comes back, even after the longest night." She sat beside him, stunned by his words. He was barely 15, but his soul carried the weight of someone who had seen lifetimes. There were other boys his age who mocked, who teased. Daniel never responded with anger. He'd smile, say little, keep moving. He wasn't interested in proving anything, because when you know who you are and whose you are, you don't need to fight for validation. You simply walk in truth. Teachers noticed it. One called Emma after a school assembly. "He's remarkable," she said. He spoke for 5 minutes and the room went silent. He didn't raise his voice. He just told the truth. And somehow, that was enough. Emma didn't say much, just wiped a tear and whispered, "Thank you," because she knew. Daniel's voice carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was rooted in character, in depth, in a life built without shortcuts. One day, a friend of the family asked him, "How are you so kind? You've been through so much." Daniel paused, thoughtful, then replied, "Because my mom never let pain become bitterness. She taught me that light still exists. So I look for it." The room went quiet, and in that silence, people were changed. Daniel's light wasn't personality. It wasn't charm. It was clarity. He knew who he was and who he wasn't. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't hunger for his father's return. But sometimes, He did wonder, not out of anger, but curiosity. Did his father know what he'd missed? Did he ever think of the boy he never held? The first steps, the first prayers, the scraped knees and whispered dreams? Daniel never asked his mother those questions out loud, but Emma felt them, and every time she did, she prayed. God, if the time comes, let it be in your way. Let it bring peace, not pain. Meanwhile, Daniel kept growing. He played music at church, not flashy solos, just simple chords. He spoke when invited, nothing rehearsed, just his heart. And when he spoke of forgiveness, people listened. Because his life gave weight to his words. He didn't hate his father. He didn't pretend it didn't matter. He simply lived in the tension, the space between what he had hoped for and what had been. And that somehow gave others permission to be honest too. Emma watched all of this unfold with quiet awe. Every meal they shared, every late-night talk, every letter from a teacher. She saw the man he was becoming, and she thanked God, not because things had gone her way, but because grace had gone deeper than she ever imagined. There's a moment every mother waits for, a moment when you realize your child has outgrown your protection, but not your love. That moment came one afternoon when Emma heard Daniel praying in his room. His voice cracked, not with pain, but with surrender. God, I don't know my father, but I trust you do. If he's still out there, I forgive him. Emma stood outside his door, breath held, tears falling. That night she didn't need to tuck him in. She just stood at his doorway and whispered, "Thank you, God. He's yours." Daniel carried light in his eyes, not because life had been easy, but because he had chosen to see beauty anyway. He had chosen to bless, not blame, to walk forward, not in denial, but in hope. He had chosen faith, and that changed everything. It was just a Saturday, no special occasion, no divine sign, just a quiet morning with sunlight spilling through the windows and Emma laughing at something Daniel had said while they walked through the grocery store aisles. They weren't shopping for anything fancy, just apples, bread, and a few things for dinner. Emma pushed the cart slowly, enjoying the calm rhythm of the moment. Daniel walked beside her, his presence taller now, older, his voice deeper, his shoulders broader. But still, he was her boy, her miracle. The grocery store was familiar, the lighting too bright, the music soft and forgettable. They passed the cereal aisle when Emma stopped to reach for a bag of oranges. Daniel cracked a quiet joke, something about how she always picked the bruised fruit out of compassion. She laughed, and that's when she heard it. A voice, a name. Emma? Just one word, but it froze her. She turned slowly, her hand still wrapped around an orange, and there, standing at the end of the aisle, was Jonathan. It had been more than a decade, 10 years since she had seen his face, but time hadn't erased the memory of his features. He looked older, yes, sharper around the eyes, his hair touched with gray, but the weight in his presence was the same. He was dressed neatly, slacks, a buttoned shirt, polished shoes. He looked successful, composed, but his eyes gave him away. There was something unsettled behind them, something searching. Emma didn't flinch. She stood tall, the orange still in her hand, and met his gaze. There was no panic, no need to run. She had faced storms far worse than this. Jonathan, for a moment, looked unsure of what to say. But then, his eyes shifted. They fell on Daniel, and everything changed. Daniel turned toward the man who had spoken his mother's name. He sensed the shift immediately, the tension, the pause in Emma's breath. He stepped forward slightly, as if to shield her, not from danger, but from discomfort. Jonathan's eyes locked on the young man, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, not full, not conscious, but something deep, subconscious, familiar. He tilted his head. "How old is he?" he asked Emma, his voice too casual, too forced. 17, she answered evenly. Jonathan blinked. She saw it in his eyes. The math, the years, the memory. It hit him all at once. Daniel extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, sir." Jonathan hesitated. His hand hovered for a moment. Then he reached out and took it. Their hands met. Firm, brief, but the moment lingered. Jonathan's breath caught. His face shifted. Because in that handshake, he felt something. The same pressure he used to feel in his own father's grip. The same calm, the same steadiness. And suddenly, He couldn't speak. Emma watched it unfold. Watched the man who once walked away now stand frozen in front of the boy he never met. The boy who had become more than a name, more than a question. Jonathan tried to recover. He smiled faintly. "He's tall," he said. "Looks like you." Emma said nothing, because she knew the truth. Daniel looked like both of them, but his character, that came from a different place. It came from pain transformed into grace. They stood there for a moment longer, the three of them. History, present, and silence, all pressed into the narrow aisle between cereal and produce. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Do you live around here?" Emma nodded. "Just a few blocks." Daniel remained quiet, respectful. Still, Jonathan's eyes drifted back to him, as if trying to memorize his features. There was a faint tremor in his voice now. "And, are you—" He paused, unsure of the word. Emma stepped in, gentle but firm. "He's my son." A pause. Then softly, "My greatest blessing." Jonathan nodded slowly, and for the first time, he looked smaller. Not because Emma made him feel that way, but because life had a way of leveling pride in unexpected places. And right here, under fluorescent lights and the scent of overripe bananas, Jonathan was meeting the version of himself he had never chosen to raise. A boy shaped without his influence. A young man who carried quiet strength. And Jonathan felt unworthy to speak. They didn't talk long, just a few more words. Pleasantries. Awkward smiles. But beneath every word was a storm. Regret. Recognition. Reverence. When they parted ways, Jonathan stood at the end of the aisle and watched them walk away. Emma placed a hand on Daniel's back as they moved forward. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply breathed. Because something sacred had just happened. Not confrontation, but collision. The past had finally looked the present in the eyes. In the car, Daniel sat quietly for a while, then he said, "Was that him?" Emma nodded. He didn't ask more. He just looked out the window and whispered, "He seems unsure." Emma smiled softly. "He is." Daniel paused, then said something that pierced the air like poetry. "I don't need him to know who I am, I already do." And Emma, hands gripping the wheel, blinked back tears, because in that moment she realized the wound was no longer open. It had healed, not perfectly, but deeply. And Jonathan? That night he couldn't sleep. He replayed the handshake, the boy's eyes, the words he didn't say. He poured a drink, then set it down untouched. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time, staring, not at his reflection, but at the shadow of the man he could have been, the father he failed to become. And he whispered into the silence, "What have I done?" But the silence had no answer. Only time would. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. It stretches between people like a wire, invisible but tense, waiting to snap or soften. That's what it felt like when Jonathan reached out to Emma. 3 days after the grocery store, he sent a message. Not dramatic, just simple. "Would you be open to meeting for coffee?" Emma read it twice, then a third time. She didn't answer right away. She prayed first, not for what to say, but for what to feel. Because after all these years, emotions could be deceptive. She didn't want revenge. She didn't need apologies. She wanted clarity and peace. She agreed. A quiet cafe, mid-morning, on a Thursday. She arrived early, sat by the window, ordered tea. When Jonathan walked in, she saw it instantly. The hesitation in his step, the way his eyes scanned the room like he was entering sacred ground. And in a way, he was. Because this was the space where consequences breathe. He approached the table slowly. She didn't stand. She offered a soft nod, then returned her gaze to the window. He sat across from her, cleared his throat. "Thank you for meeting me." Emma nodded again. The silence between them was thick, not awkward, just full of things left unsaid for a decade. Jonathan spoke first. "I saw him, and I knew." Emma didn't flinch. "I could see it in his eyes, in the way he stood, in the way he looked at you." He paused, then added, "Is he mine?" Her gaze didn't waver. She nodded. "Yes," one word, but it carried the weight of years. Jonathan inhaled slowly, like he'd been punched. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. If I had, Emma raised her hand gently. "Let's not pretend," she said. Her voice was kind, but firm. "You left. Not just me, but the idea of us. The idea of love. Of roots." Jonathan lowered his eyes. "I wasn't ready. I was scared. And I was pregnant," she replied. Not bitterly, just fact. Silence again. Outside the window, people walked by, lives moving, unaware of the reckoning happening inside. Jonathan spoke next. "He's remarkable." Emma nodded. "He is. I don't know how to explain what I felt when I saw him. It was like looking in a mirror, but cleaner, brighter. He's not you," she said gently. "But yes, he carries something." Jonathan blinked back something that looked like shame. "I kept thinking, what if I had stayed? What if I had known?" Emma folded her hands. "I used to ask those questions too, but they don't lead anywhere. What happened, happened. What matters now is what you do next." He looked up. "I don't even know if I have a place in his life." "That's not your choice," she said. "It's his." Jonathan nodded. "I don't want to take anything from you." "You can't," Emma replied. That stunned him. She continued, "What I've built with him is untouchable, because it was never about replacing anything. It was about becoming who he needed." The silence turned softer, still full, but no longer sharp. Jonathan leaned back. "He said something to me just before we walked away. He said, 'Nice to meet you, sir.' But the way he said it, I felt like he was giving me a chance, or testing me. I don't know." Emma looked down at her cup. "He gives people more than they deserve sometimes, but he does it with open hands." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "I've lived so much of my life for myself." "I know," she said. And she did. She had seen it in his eyes years ago. The hunger, the fear, the pride. But now, she saw something else. A man, finally reckoning with the emptiness he'd created. Jonathan rubbed his hands together. "What would you say if I wanted to talk to him? Not force anything. Just ask if he'd be willing." Emma thought for a moment. "He's not a child anymore. You'll need to come as a man. Not a ghost from the past. Not with guilt. Just honesty. I don't even know how to start." "Then let that be your start," she said softly. "Tell him that." They sat in silence again, not awkward, just human. Two people who once shared a dream, now sharing a table, holding the pieces, not to rebuild the past, but to honor the truth. Jonathan finally stood. "I don't expect forgiveness." Emma rose too. "That's not yours to expect, but you can make space for it." He nodded, then paused. "Emma, thank you for raising him, for protecting him, for not telling him I was—" She interrupted kindly. "I told him the truth. I just didn't let your absence define it." He looked down. Then slowly he walked away. Not redeemed, but perhaps repentant. Emma watched him leave, then sat back down. Her tea was cold, but her heart felt strangely light. Not because everything was healed, but because something sacred had begun. The weight of silence had broken, and in its place, space for something new. He couldn't sleep. Not really. Jonathan lay in bed, the room quiet, the sheets tangled at his feet, the ceiling above him a canvas for every thought he had tried to avoid for 10 years. And all he could see were those eyes, Daniel's eyes, eyes that held no resentment, no accusation, just calm, just presence. But that was what haunted him most, the calm, because it wasn't the calm of indifference. It was the calm of someone who had been through fire and chosen to remain soft. Jonathan turned over, tried to close his eyes, but the boy's voice echoed. "Nice to meet you, sir." So simple, so polite, but it had struck something deep. He rose early, earlier than usual. He walked through his penthouse, untouched by time or joy. Everything was in its place, and yet, he felt utterly misplaced. He stood at the window looking out over the skyline. So many buildings, so much success, and still, silence. He had spent years building a life that looked impressive from the outside, but now, it felt hollow. He sat at his desk, opened a drawer, pulled out an old photo, the only one he had kept from those early years with Emma. She was smiling, young, hopeful. He remembered the day. They had no money, but she had baked a cake, burned it slightly. They laughed for hours. He had forgotten how free he once felt with her, before ambition replaced tenderness, before fear disguised itself as logic. Before he walked out, he placed the photo beside a blank piece of paper, and then he began to write. He didn't think. He just let the words fall out. Emma, I don't know where to start, but that didn't feel right. He scratched it out, started again. Daniel, I'm sorry. No, not yet. He tore the page, tried again. I saw myself in your eyes and I didn't know what to do with that. Better. Not perfect, but better. He wrote late into the night. Letters he'd never send. Words he wasn't sure he had the right to speak. But somehow, the act of writing became a kind of confession. To God, to himself, to the man he had failed to become. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel sat in his room reading a book. Emma passed by his door and paused. He looked peaceful, mature beyond his years. He turned the page, unaware of the storm he had stirred in a man who once walked away. Emma whispered a prayer, not for Jonathan's return, but for Daniel's future, that no shadow from the past would darken his light, that grace would continue to shape him, even in confusion, even in truth. Jonathan returned to the cafe the next day. He sat in the same chair where Emma had met him. He stared at the table, at the chair across from him, and imagined Daniel sitting there. Would he listen? Would he care? Would he see the man trying, even after so long? He walked the streets after that, not aimless, but not with a clear destination either. He passed a playground, watched a boy throw a football to his dad. The boy missed. The father laughed, tousled his hair and said, "Try again." Jonathan felt a sting, because no matter what he did now, he had missed those moments. The scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the first, "I love you." He had chosen distance, and now, distance was choosing him. That night, he lay in bed again, and this time, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, tears slipping down the sides of his face into the pillow. Tears for what he'd done, what he hadn't done, and what he could never undo. He whispered into the darkness, "God, I don't deserve a second chance, but if it's still possible, let him know I see him now. Let him know I care." It wasn't a polished prayer, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Emma, that same night, found a letter on her doorstep. No envelope, just folded once. She recognized the handwriting. She sat on the couch, unfolded it, and read, "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to miss his life. But now that I've seen him, I can't unsee. I don't know what the future holds. I just know I'd like to be part of it if he'll let me." She read it twice, then placed it on the table. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "Your will be done." Because Emma knew, there are wounds that time doesn't heal. Only humility does. Only truth. Only love, real, hard, raw love, has the power to restore what pride destroyed. And Jonathan? He continued to be haunted, not by guilt alone, but by wonder, by the realization that somewhere out there was a boy who had grown into a man without him, and still carried light, the kind of light that could pierce even the darkest regret. Some truths are easier to write than to speak. Jonathan had always been a man of deals and decisions. He signed contracts worth millions, held negotiations that shaped companies, but when it came to one boy, one sentence, he froze. He had started dozens of letters, on napkins, notebooks, Word documents that were typed, deleted, then rewritten again. None of them felt right, because none of them could carry the weight of what he had missed. The apartment was silent. Evening light washed across the floor. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. He sat at the table, pen in hand, a blank sheet in front of him. Again, he stared at it for long minutes. Then finally he began. Daniel, just the name. He paused, wrote it again. Not because he needed to, but because he needed to feel it. The name he had once whispered to himself in passing. The name Emma had once mentioned, years ago, as a dream for the future. He never knew she had given it to their son. And now that name had a face, a voice, a presence that haunted his peace. "I don't expect this letter to make things right," he wrote. "I don't expect forgiveness or understanding. I just want to offer what I never gave you. Honesty." He stopped, closed his eyes, tried to remember the moment he walked away, What he was wearing, what she was doing, what she said or didn't say. He could remember the door closing, the silence after, but not the courage it took for her to stay. He never stayed long enough to see it. He began to write again. I left not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to care in a way that didn't cost me everything I thought I needed. Success, space, control. I thought I could come back later, when I had more to offer. But the longer I stayed gone, the harder it became to face what I'd done. The pen slowed. He looked out the window. The city pulsed outside. Cars moved like silent thoughts. I missed your first steps, your first words, your laughter. I missed teaching you how to ride a bike. I missed birthdays, bedtime stories, the sound of you calling someone dad. He felt something tighten in his chest. Tears threatened. He wrote on. I missed everything, and I'm the only one to blame. He set the pen down, stared at the letter. It wasn't elegant, but it was real. He folded it slowly, placed it in an envelope, wrote a name on the front, just Daniel, then hesitated. That envelope sat on his nightstand for days. He carried it in his jacket pocket once, walked all the way to Emma's house, but never rang the bell. He stood on the sidewalk, heart pounding, watched the light in the window, watched Daniel pass by, laughing about something on the phone. Jonathan stood frozen, a man with a name on his lips, and no voice to speak it. He left without delivering the letter. At home, he paced the floor. He thought of all the moments he had postponed. He thought of the ache he had buried so deep he had convinced himself it didn't exist. But now, it bled through everything. He opened the letter again, read it aloud to the empty room. His voice cracked, then broke. He sank into the couch, holding the paper like a wound. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel sat with Emma in the kitchen. They were flipping through old journals of his, laughing at stories he had written as a child. Emma's eyes lingered on one page, a prayer he had written at age 9. God, thank you for my mom, and please help me understand the parts of my story I don't know yet. She ran her finger over the words, heart heavy. Daniel noticed. Did I write that? You did, she said. He smiled. I guess I always felt something missing. Emma closed the journal. Maybe not missing, she said softly. Just waiting. The next day, Jonathan visited the church again. It was quiet. He sat in the last pew, not to be seen, not even to pray, just to be still, to stop running. The door opened behind him. A few others walked in. He didn't turn. He just listened. To the silence, to his breath, to the weight of what he carried. He thought again of the letter, still in his jacket pocket, still sealed. After the service, he approached the pastor, a man maybe 10 years older than him, warm, kind eyes. I'm not a member, Jonathan said, but my son, he speaks here. The pastor's eyes softened. You're Daniel's father. Jonathan nodded slowly. I don't know what that means yet, but I'd like to learn. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder. Start with presence, he said. Words can wait. That night, Jonathan wrote again. Not a new letter, a journal entry. To himself. I'm learning to sit with silence, to stop trying to explain away my absence, to face what I ran from. I don't know if Daniel will ever let me in, but today I sat in the same room. That's something. He closed the journal, and for the first time in years, slept without the letter under his pillow. He hadn't given it, but maybe he was learning how to become it. Some truths don't explode. They don't come with thunder or fury. They arrive quietly, soft, steady, devastating, like a whisper that changes everything. That's how it came for Jonathan. Not through a confrontation, but through a name, a moment, a memory. It had been days since he last saw Daniel, weeks since the grocery store. He hadn't reached out again, not directly. He didn't know how, but something kept drawing him back to the church, not for faith, not at first, but for proximity, just to sit in the same room, to breathe the same air, to watch the boy who carried a part of him he had never earned the right to claim. It was a Sunday morning. The sanctuary was filled. Light filtered through stained glass. Jonathan took his usual place in the back, unnoticed. He watched as people filed in, families, couples, children, and then Daniel, walking down the aisle with confidence, not pride, holding a worn Bible, smiling at someone near the front. He stepped onto the stage, stood behind the microphone. The room hushed, and Jonathan leaned forward. Daniel began to speak, but he wasn't giving a sermon. He was sharing a story, his own. "There was a time," Daniel said, "when I believed that a father's absence meant I wasn't enough, that I had done something wrong, that maybe if I had been different, he would have stayed." A ripple passed through the crowd. Jonathan's breath caught. Daniel's voice stayed calm. "But then, I watched my mother. I watched the way she loved, the way she prayed, the way she never let bitterness become her story." Jonathan felt something shift in his chest. A pressure, a crack. Daniel went on. "And one day I realized I wasn't missing something. I was being shaped." He paused, looked out over the crowd, then added, "God didn't abandon me. He was building me." A woman seated near Jonathan leaned over and whispered to her friend, "He's Emma's son." The friend nodded. "Yes, his name is Daniel." Jonathan's eyes widened. The name. It hit him like a wave. A flood of memory surged through him. 10 years ago, a conversation in a small kitchen, Emma stirring a pot of soup, Jonathan pacing. She had told him, almost shyly, "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Daniel." He had smiled. "After your grandfather?" She nodded. "And because the name means, God is my judge. I want our son to grow up knowing he doesn't have to prove himself to anyone." He had nodded then, but he left the next week, and never knew she kept the name. Now, sitting in that church, hearing it spoken, Daniel, his soul buckled. He whispered to himself, barely able to breathe. She named him after all. It was as if the past had unraveled at his feet. He hadn't just walked away from a woman. He had walked away from a promise, from a name he once said with tenderness, from a boy who had carried that name like a banner, a boy who had become a man. Without him, tears filled Jonathan's eyes. Not dramatic, just honest. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, because for the first time, he saw everything, not just the pain he caused, but the beauty he had missed. Daniel wasn't just his son. He was his redemption, and he had almost missed it all. After the service, Jonathan didn't move. He stayed seated long after the crowd dispersed. Emma saw him from a distance. She didn't approach. She just watched and prayed, because some moments aren't meant to be interrupted. They're meant to be surrendered. Jonathan finally stood. His legs were weak, his hands shaking. He stepped outside. The sky was overcast, but the air was warm. He walked to his car, but didn't get in. He leaned against the door, looked up, whispered, "God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." There was no answer. Just wind, just trees rustling softly. But inside, something was different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was broken, in the best possible way. That night he opened the drawer where he kept the letters. Read them one by one. Some were angry, some were desperate, some were ashamed. But one stood out. It was the one that simply said, "If I could go back, I wouldn't leave. But since I can't, I want to learn how to stay." He took that letter, folded it, placed it in a new envelope, and this time, he wrote Daniel's full name on the front. Then, he placed it by the door, ready, for the first time, because some revelations don't end the story. They begin it, with truth, with humility, with hope, even after all the years, even after all the silence. Because when grace touches regret, even the most shattered soul can rise again. He didn't know what he would say. Jonathan stood outside the church after service, hands trembling slightly, heart thudding with a rhythm he hadn't felt since youth, not from fear but from reverence. The letter was in his coat pocket, not just ink on paper, but his soul, folded. He looked up at the sky. Gray clouds, low and quiet, hovered like thoughts yet to be spoken. He whispered, "If now is the time, let it be mercy." Emma stepped out first. She saw him. Their eyes met. No need for words. She gave a soft nod, the kind that says, "It's not in my hands anymore." And then, Daniel walked out, laughing with a friend, unaware of the moment about to unfold. Until he saw him, the world seemed to pause, not in drama, but in stillness. Daniel looked at Jonathan, not with shock, just not with anger, openness, as if some part of him had known this day would come. He stepped toward him, One step, then another. Jonathan stood rooted. Then, with effort, he reached into his coat, pulled out the letter, and held it out. Daniel didn't take it at first. He looked into the man's eyes, and in them, he saw sorrow, but not the kind that manipulates, the kind that repents, the kind that breaks. "I don't know how to do this," Jonathan said quietly, "but I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Daniel held his gaze, then slowly took the letter. Didn't read it, just held it. Jonathan's voice cracked. "I missed your life. I missed everything." He couldn't continue. Tears filled his eyes. Not performative, not controlled, just real. Tears that had waited years to fall. Daniel's grip tightened around the letter. He didn't cry. He didn't step back. He took a breath and said, "You left, but I never stopped being loved." Jonathan blinked. "By who?" Daniel looked at him and replied, "By God and by her." He nodded toward Emma. Jonathan turned. She stood at a distance, still, whole. She had nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim. She had already won. Daniel continued, "I'm not here to punish you. I've already made peace." Jonathan covered his face with his hands, ashamed, undone. "I don't deserve that." Daniel waited a moment, then quietly, "None of us deserve grace. That's what makes it grace." There it was. Redemption. Not as a reward, but as a door. Jonathan looked up, eyes swollen, voice broken. "Do you think, one day, we could talk?" Daniel nodded. Today is that day. They didn't talk long. They didn't dive into the past. They just sat, on the church steps, in silence, in shared air, in something new. Emma eventually walked over. She didn't say much, just placed her hand gently on Jonathan's shoulder. He looked up, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not fully, not boldly, but honestly. It was the smile of a man who had stopped running. Daniel unfolded the letter that night. Alone in his room, he read each word slowly. There was no manipulation, no excuses, just truth, just a father finally finding the courage to face his own shadow. When he finished, he placed the letter back in the envelope. Then he prayed, "God, thank you for giving me the strength to wait, and the heart to forgive." He didn't forget the years of absence, but he didn't carry them as chains. He carried them as proof that grace can rewrite what pain tried to erase. Jonathan came back the next Sunday, and the next, not to reclaim anything, just to show up, to sit, to listen, to stay. He and Daniel began to meet. Coffee, walks, quiet talks, no rush, no pressure, just presence. Jonathan didn't try to fill the role of father. He tried to learn what it meant to be a man worth knowing. And in that, something grew. Not restoration of what had been lost, but the creation of something new. Emma watched all of it with peace. She didn't need him to become what he hadn't been. She had become everything Daniel needed. But she knew. There's healing in humility. And in Jonathan, she saw it now. Not perfection, not penance, but a man who had finally surrendered. There were still tears, but now they came with clarity, with release, with quiet joy, because what had once been broken was being held by hands greater than their own. Some endings don't close the book. They open a new chapter, not in triumph, but in tenderness, in truth revealed, and lives rethreaded by grace. This story wasn't about perfect redemption. It was about presence, the kind that returns, the kind that stays, the kind that no longer needs to prove itself, because it has finally surrendered. Jonathan didn't become a different man overnight. He became a truer one. Bit by bit, day by day, he began showing up not with explanations, but with quiet consistency. He called not to talk, but to listen. He met Daniel for walks, sat with Emma for coffee, and joined church services not as a gesture but as a longing. Not for forgiveness alone, but for family. Daniel never stopped being cautious, but he wasn't bitter. He let the relationship grow slowly, not as a boy yearning for a father, but as a man willing to welcome the human behind the absence. He asked questions, hard ones, and Jonathan, this time, didn't hide. He answered as best he could, and when he couldn't, he simply said, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry," and somehow, that was enough. Emma continued her life. She still worked, still prayed, still lived in the same small home where love had filled every empty corner. People asked her if she felt vindicated. She would smile gently and say, "I didn't pray for revenge. I prayed for peace." And now, peace had come. Not because Jonathan returned, but because grace had stayed. The day Daniel graduated, the sun broke through heavy clouds. The ceremony was small. Emma wore her best dress. Jonathan sat a few rows behind her. And when Daniel's name was called, both of them stood, not beside each other but bound by the same pride. Emma clutched a tissue. Jonathan clutched his heart. Because that name, Daniel, was no longer a name of regret. It had become a name of revelation. Later that evening, they gathered in Emma's backyard. Just the three of them. A table, simple food, laughter without force. Jonathan looked at his son across the table and said softly, "You didn't need me to become who you are, but I needed you to remember who I was meant to be." Daniel didn't respond right away. Then he raised his glass of water and said, "To reintroductions." They clinked, not in celebration of perfection, but of presence. Emma sat in her chair, the sun dipping low behind her. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to breathe, to remember, to thank. Because when God reveals, He doesn't do it to shame. He does it to heal. He doesn't bring the truth to light to punish. He brings it to make whole what was fractured, to call back what was lost, to restore not only what was broken, but to rewrite it into something better, something truer. Daniel would go on to lead others, not because of what he had, but because of what he had learned. He became a man of strength wrapped in gentleness, a leader without ego, a speaker without masks. And when people asked him about his father, he'd say, "I didn't grow up with him, but now I walk with him." Jonathan never again tried to reclaim what he had missed. Instead, he gave what he still had: time, love, honesty. He sat in the front row of Daniel's talks. He took Emma to dinner on her birthday. He served behind the scenes at the church, and when someone once asked, "Are you trying to make up for the past?" he said, "No, I'm just grateful for the present." Emma kept praying, not because she needed more, but because she knew gratitude is a form of worship. She would sit by her window some nights, candle lit, Bible open, and she would smile, because the storm that once left her broken had become the soil where restoration grew. And one day, years later, when Daniel married, he asked both of them to stand beside him, not because they were a picture of tradition, but because they were proof of grace, proof that love doesn't always come in perfect form, but it can still be faithful, still be real, still be worth waiting for. At the end of the night, Jonathan stood alone for a moment, watching Daniel and his new bride dance. Emma approached, gently. He turned, eyes soft. "She did well," Emma said, nodding at the young woman. "She did," Jonathan agreed. "And so did he." Emma looked at him. "You both did." He blinked, because he had spent years believing he was the man who left. Now, he was the man who returned, not to rewrite the past, but to honor the present. The music played, the lights shimmered, and three people who had once been strangers to each other's wounds now shared the same table of healing, not because life had been fair, but because God had been faithful. So to every woman who has ever prayed in silence, to every man who has wrestled with regret, to every child who wonders if the broken things can ever be whole again, this story whispers, yes, not because of us, but because of Him. God doesn't just expose what's hidden. He reveals to restore. He breaks to rebuild. And He writes stories we never saw coming, with endings we didn't dare to hope for. Because grace is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of God in the middle of it, saying, "Watch what I can do with what they thought was lost. And He who began a good work will be faithful to complete it."